Jasmine Crockett's name lit up Congress today in a way that no one expected. For years, the story of Jeffrey Epstein has been treated like a closed case, a scandal that ended the day he was locked away and later found dead in his cell. But Crockett shattered that illusion. She stood before cameras and lawmakers and revealed what too many in power have tried to bury. This was never just about one man. Epstein was the face of something far darker, an entire system designed to shield predators, silence victims, and protect the wealthy at all costs. And for the very first time, a survivor stood up in Congress and told her story, breaking decades of silence and cover-ups.
I'm sure many of you don't recall, but we were sent home early to try to avoid being able to take a vote on something like getting these files. We are about doing real transparency. We don't care who's in the files. We are going after you. So if I had to sum up what happened today, we heard the stories of victims, and honestly, we heard the story of at least one person that has never come forward before today. This was the very first time that she was telling anyone in a semi-public way her story. And if I had to summarize the theme, I would say that their theme was to do something. It is probably the theme of the American people in general right now when it comes to government, is that they want us to do something. So yes, we had the roundtable, but they actually want to see some action. The fact that this started off in the 90s, and we had someone who could talk about what happened to them in the 90s. But then you go down the line and you've got somebody that's telling us their story from 2008. These failures led to years and years of abuse that did not have to take place. And so the reality is this. Some think that this is all over and some think that nothing else is going on. But if there was ever a RICO case, it would have been the Epstein case. So how we went from something that should have been RICO because of how sophisticated of a system this was, and this wasn't just one little sick old man that was doing stuff, but there were so many layers, whether we're talking about the banks that were involved, whether we're talking about those that worked for him, that helped him, whether we're talking about the monster known as Maxwell, and that's exactly how y'all need to refer to her. She is a monster. She is not a victim. So let me tell you, I want some action items to come out of this because for once we somewhat look like we're bipartisan in the Oversight Committee. Number one, we need answers. We need answers on why it is that Maxwell was transferred from her current station or her former station in Florida down to Texas. We need to have an understanding because everything that I heard today leads me to know that for sure she was all up and in and through this entire process, not to mention that she was indicted by a jury of her peers and then she was tried and convicted and given 20 years. So why is it that we had somebody, again, it almost seems like we are doomed to repeat our failures, because why is it we have high-level people that seemingly are running cover for a criminal? And that is what she is. She is a monster and she is a criminal. So number one, we need answers on what happened with that transfer, why it took place. And honestly, we all need to stand together and say that Maxwell needs to go back to where the monsters go, which is to a higher level of security. We also need to understand that Debbie Wasserman Schultz has legislation that she has been trying to push forward. And so in a bipartisan way, we all need to get behind Debbie, because we found and what we learned is that there were loopholes as it relates to the Crime Victims Act. And so we've got to make sure that no other victims suffer in the way that they did when you have somebody like Alex Acosta that decides that he wants to play games and dismiss a case and never inform the victims of what's going on as is required by law. So we are going to have to fix those loopholes to make sure that that doesn't happen, because it took them 10 years of fighting this, and ultimately by the time they got to the end of it, well, it also was Jeffrey Epstein's end, and so there was not a resolution for that. And the final thing that I think that we need to do is, obviously, we need to continue to push forward and make sure that we get all the files, because we know that we have not received them all. Because I am standing in front of the press, I'm also going to make a plea. One of the things that I realized was that there's a lot of stuff that the DOJ may have, but honestly, if you don't have a thorough investigation, and I can't say if we had a thorough investigation or not, we have no idea. But the reality is that when you have investigators that go out and they collect information. I am not necessarily convinced that they even have gone out and done their due diligence to fully investigate this case in the first place. So if there's anyone in the public that believes that you have information that would be valuable, you've never been able to get through to federal agencies, or no one would listen to you when you try to go forward and bring information forward, I am asking that you trust oversight DIMS and you bring that information to us. Or if you know where some information is contained, let us know so that we can then send subpoenas out that way. We want to do right not only by those that have already suffered under Epstein, but we want to prevent other trafficking rings that we know are out there. We want to make sure that we are doing right for future generations. So with that, I now have the honor of presenting to you the firecracker out of New York.
Crockett didn't just listen, she connected the dots that most have been too afraid to say out loud. And what came next wasn't just testimony, it was a direct challenge to the foundations of American justice. For the first time in congressional history, a survivor of Epstein's abuse stood up and told her story in front of lawmakers. Think about that. For decades, victims were silenced, intimidated, or pushed into the shadows while powerful figures told us Epstein was just a lone predator. But when this woman spoke, the room shifted. Her voice wasn't just her own, it carried the weight of countless others who were never given the chance to be heard. She described pain that began in the 1990s and echoed through years of neglect and betrayal by the very institutions meant to protect her. What made it so powerful wasn't just the story itself, but the moment it represented. After years of rumors, sealed files, and whispered accusations, a survivor finally had a platform that couldn't be ignored. Crockett made sure that her words weren't lost in the noise of Washington. She framed them as a call to action, proof that this wasn't a closed chapter but a living, unfinished fight for justice. And just when the testimony seemed overwhelming, Crockett reminded everyone this wasn't just about one woman's story. It was about exposing the entire system that made her silence possible. What became clear after the survivor spoke was that Epstein's crimes were never just about one predator. Representative Jasmine Crockett said it plainly, this was a system. A carefully built network designed to protect abusers, silence victims, and shield the wealthy from consequences. Epstein may have been the face of it, but behind him stood banks moving his money, staff managing his properties, and high-profile allies who looked the other way. And then there was Ghislaine Maxwell, described by Crockett not as a victim but as a monster. Together they operated with a sophistication that made the entire scandal resemble organized crime. In fact, Crockett compared it directly to a RICO case, pointing out how multiple actors worked together across decades and borders. That's not just exploitation, it's coordination. And the real tragedy, law enforcement had every opportunity to see this for what it was, yet time and time again they chose not to. The system didn't fail by accident. It failed by design, to protect the powerful while sacrificing the vulnerable. And once you start pulling at those threads, the depth of complicity becomes impossible to ignore. If the Epstein scandal revealed anything, it's how deeply the justice system failed those it was supposed to protect. Victims came forward as early as the 1990s, yet their voices were brushed aside. By the 2000s, the pattern was undeniable: complaints, warnings, and evidence all piled up, but instead of accountability, the powerful closed ranks. One of the most shocking examples came in 2008 when then U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta brokered a secret plea deal with Epstein. Under the Crime Victims Act, those who suffered were supposed to be informed of every development. Instead, they were kept in the dark while Epstein walked away with a sweetheart deal that shielded not just him but potentially his entire network. Crockett made it clear that wasn't just negligence, that was systemic corruption. Every loophole left open, every deal struck behind closed doors sent a message to survivors that their pain didn't matter as much as Epstein's connections. And every time justice was bent, the cycle of abuse continued unchecked. This wasn't just a failure of one prosecutor or one case, it was a betrayal by the institutions meant to stand guard over the law. And this is where Pam Bondi's name cannot be ignored. During her time as Florida's Attorney General, critics pointed to her role in the state's handling of Epstein-related matters. Questions were raised about decisions not to aggressively pursue leads, about why certain prosecutions never gained traction, and whether political considerations played a role. Crockett's push for accountability indirectly calls out figures like Bondi, those in positions of power who had opportunities to act but instead left survivors in the shadows. The failures weren't limited to one prosecutor or one office, they were woven across the system, and that's why Epstein's case remains such a glaring stain on American justice. As if the failures weren't already glaring, Representative Jasmine Crockett raised another disturbing point, the curious case of Ghislaine Maxwell. Convicted by a jury of her peers sentenced to 20 years behind bars, Maxwell was supposed to serve her time under the strictest conditions. Yet quietly and without explanation she was transferred from her Florida facility to Texas. Crockett didn't mince words, she demanded answers. Why was this move made? Who authorized it, and what purpose did it serve? To Crockett this wasn't just about prison logistics, it was about accountability. Because every time a high-profile figure like Maxwell receives unusual treatment, it feeds suspicion that powerful people are still being protected. Crockett reminded everyone in the room that Maxwell was no victim, no bystander. She was Epstein's right hand, an active participant who recruited and enabled abuse, a monster as Crockett called her who deserved no leniency and no special cover. Yet the unanswered questions around her transfer cast a shadow over the system once again. If transparency can't even exist around one convicted trafficker, how can the public trust that justice will be served on those who remain unnamed? Crockett didn't just point out failures, she demanded fixes. One of the most urgent issues she raised was the loopholes in victims' rights laws. Time and again survivors were left in the dark about critical decisions in the Epstein case, decisions that directly violated the Crime Victims Act. Why? Because the law had gaps, and prosecutors like Alex Acosta exploited them to cut deals in secret. Crockett highlighted legislation championed by Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz as a critical step forward. That bill aims to ensure victims are always notified and always given a voice, no matter how powerful the defendant may be. What makes this significant is that for once there seems to be bipartisan agreement. Both Democrats and Republicans on the Oversight Committee expressed a willingness to push for reform. Crockett framed it as more than a legal fix, it was about restoring trust in a system that has failed too many for too long. If those loopholes aren't closed, history will keep repeating itself. And every time it does, survivors are forced to relive their trauma while elites walk free. But the legal fixes were only part of the story. The bigger problem was what remained hidden. Even as reforms were discussed, Crockett made one thing very clear: we still don't have the full picture. Oversight has not received all the Epstein files, and the Department of Justice has yet to explain why. After decades of whispers and partial disclosures, the idea that critical evidence is still hidden only deepens the sense of betrayal. Crockett suggested that investigators may not have even conducted a thorough probe in the first place. If that's true, then what we've seen so far could just be the tip of the iceberg. She issued a direct plea to the public: if you have information, if you know where documents or evidence might exist, bring it forward. Because waiting on institutions alone won't guarantee transparency. The secrecy surrounding Epstein's network is not accidental, it's intentional. Every missing file means unanswered questions. Who else was involved? How far did the cover-up go? And why, even now, are the most powerful names still being protected? For Crockett, sunlight isn't just a metaphor, it's the only way forward. But the missing files were just one piece of a much larger reality: how deeply power and wealth can bend the system to their will. The Epstein scandal has always been more than a crime story, it's a window into how power really works in America. Crockett reminded Congress and the country that Epstein wasn't operating alone. His wealth and connections allowed him to bend rules, delay justice, and silence victims. Banks moved his money, influential allies shielded him, staff carried out his orders, and at every stage accountability slipped further away. This wasn't just corruption, it was a culture of silence where protecting the powerful mattered more than protecting the vulnerable. That imbalance of power explains why, decades later, so many names remain hidden and so many files remain sealed. Crockett's words cut through the excuses. Until every enabler is named and every file is opened, the cycle will repeat. Victims will remain silenced while the elite remain untouchable. And the chilling truth: Epstein may be gone, but the system that protected him still exists. It's a system designed to keep the public in the dark and the powerful safe. which is why Crockett ended her remarks with a challenge, not just to Congress but to the people listening. Crockett's final message wasn't just about Epstein or Maxwell, it was about us. She made it clear that unless the public keeps demanding answers, the truth will stay buried. Justice cannot survive on silence, and silence is exactly what has protected predators and their enablers for decades. The question now isn't only what Congress will do next, it's whether ordinary people will push hard enough to make sure every file is released, every name is revealed, and every loophole is closed. Crockett's challenge was simple: don't look away, don't let the scandal fade into another headline. Hold lawmakers accountable, support legislation that strengthens victims' rights, and keep demanding transparency, no matter how uncomfortable it gets. Because this story is no longer just about Epstein, it's about a system that failed and will keep failing unless it's forced to change. Will we accept that powerful figures can manipulate justice and hide behind wealth, or will we demand the truth, even if it shakes the foundations of power? In the end, Crockett left us with a choice: continue living in silence or insist on the sunlight that finally exposes everything hidden in the dark.